Welcome to Recross the Paths. My name is Cade, and my guest today is Turner. Welcome, Turner.
Hey, glad to be here.
It's a treat to have you here. Turner curates, along with many other projects, the Tempo Cube. I'm excited to dive into this today.
Yeah, me too.
Before we get into an overview, how would you define the term tempo?
Great question. I feel like that word in specific, just everyone kind of has a different way they define it or think about it. So I'm going to give, I guess, my definition in terms of of how I want to define it for this cube. So the way I see it is tempo is relating to what you would think of as a tempo deck, where it's like you're trying to stick a threat, usually a pretty cheap threat. Let's call it Delver of Secrets, pretty classic tempo example. You're trying to stick a threat and follow it up with tempo spells that don't exactly gain you card advantage, but they gain you mana advantage, meaning, you're spending 1 or 2 mana to deal with your opponent's 4 or 5 mana threats, or you're spending 1 mana on a spell pierce to counter whatever removal spell or planeswalker they have that's going to answer your cheaper threat. And so by gaining that mana advantage, you can usually get under your opponents and try to win quickly, but not as quick as a dedicated aggro deck. So kind of somewhere in the middle between, some people call it like an aggro control. Hybrid between that would be a tempo deck. And usually you think about those kinds of decks as being blue based, like blue red or blue green, but it can definitely expand to any color across the board. And that's kind of what I'm aiming to accomplish with this cube.
You suggested something like Delver of Secrets, very blue, your counter magic, very
Yeah,
blue, but
that's right.
um, I imagine as you're trying to gain a mana advantage, that also leans into things like combat tricks. That also leans
Oh
into
yeah,
protection for removal spells. And I don't want to tip the
absolutely.
hand too far here. um,
No, those are some of my favorite spells, and something I wish we would see show up in other designers' cubes a little bit more often.
so when we think about tempo, a lot of it is about pacing, and not, I suppose, not in the temporal sense, but just in the action to action, how things play out. It's not just haymakers back and forth, but it sounds like you're aiming for lots of small decisions that lead to a conclusion.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that, I guess, leads to the first restriction that my cube has, is that every card in the cube is castable for 3 or less mana. So I'm really trying to emphasize, um, the ability to cast multiple spells in a turn and being able to start playing the game on the first 1 or 2 turns, having spells that you can cast, or just or having answers to what your opponent may be casting, even if you're not necessarily, being the aggressor in that game.
Before we dive too far into all of our restrictions, do you want to give us an elevator pitch of the Tempo Cube so that we get a holistic view of it as we unpack it?
Sure. The Tempo Cube has kind of an interesting history, which I will briefly touch on, but it started as a cube that I called the Voltron Cube. And I still have that in my Cube Cobra profile if you want to look at that, but I definitely haven't touched it in forever. Um, and the idea there was basically to take, it was an archetypal cube, and for each color pair, I wanted to take a linear kind of aggro combo deck and translate it into drafting it as a cube. So, for example, blue green was the Boggles archetype, or blue white was heroic, black white was aristocrats, and that was kind of the initial goal. And it kind of translates a little bit to what I have now, which is, you're wanting to stick an early threat, you're wanting to either protect it or enhance it or buff it somehow and have that carry you to victory. Um, Ran into a lot of problems with that cube, and part of that involved imposing a bunch of restrictions on kind of the effects that I realized didn't play into the cube's goals, and eventually ended up to where I am now, which is, so cheap cards, cheap threats, iconic creatures, and lots of combat tricks and just kind of intense back and forth gameplay, starting with the very first few turns. Uh, I guess that's my it's a bit of a long-winded elevator pitch, but hopefully covered the important bits.
No, that's good. And how you got there is a neat thing too. That it came from an idea that maybe didn't fulfill all the things you're after, and finding a way to refine it into something that is certainly much closer to it.
That's right.
One of the things that I've appreciated here is that you talk about in your overview, which is a great read, by the way. If anybody's looking for examples of overviews, if you like to provide a lot of information, this is a really well put together one. Um, where you talk about creatures are king. That so much of this environment is about, like you said, sticking a threat, and that threat is almost always a creature.
That's right. Yeah, you're not casting planeswalkers or underworld breaches or anything like that. I guess you could describe this as a fair cube where no shenanigans are going on,
Unless you consider snakeskin veil shenanigans.
which some people do. I've gotten that feedback before.
So you mentioned there were a number of restrictions that you imposed to help get from the Voltron cube to where the Tempo cube is currently. Let's run through those right quickly, just as a summary.
Sure, yeah. So initially, it's just all spells must be castable for 3 or less mana, and that was just to kind of give it a cap and make sure that everything's being low to the ground and cheap cards that you can play multiple times. And also just a lot of the most iconic cards in the game are those 1, 2, sometimes 3 mana creatures or spells that you see show up in not just a lot of cubes, but a lot of constructed formats as well. Like, we mentioned Delver of Secrets earlier, which was a king in standard and even back to modern and legacy. But also, your ponders, your dark confidants, your lightning bolts. Just I wanted a home for all of these constructed cards to also feel like they can feel like drafting constructed decks using them in this cube. So that's kind of the main one. And then the rest of these restrictions kind of came about as I went through the process of balancing this cube. So one of them I'll start with is the lack of wraths. So removal, like Wrath of God, Damnation, Toxic Deluge that you usually see in most cubes.
Kind of the quintessential answer to most creature-based decks.
Exactly right. And I felt like if I'm designing a cube that's primarily focused around creature combat and wanting to protect creatures, that easy ways to get 2, 3, 4 for 1s in terms of board advantage just doesn't play super well. I think I've included, I can't remember exactly, but I may have had Toxic Deluge in the cube at one point just because it was 3 mana or less, and just the ability to sit back while your opponent kind of plays to the board and then just wrath, and now your opponent has nothing and probably no cards in hand as well, because you don't have the non-creature methods of recurring your card advantage such as planeswalkers or enchantments, which I guess kind of leads into the next one, which is that there's no planeswalkers in the cube. If you want this to be a creature based cube, then you don't want the board to revolve around one non-creature planeswalker in this example, just on the board, providing way too much advantage and not having many ways to interact with it. The interaction is kind of what makes the Tempo cube flow, I guess is a word for it. I want this tempo gameplay, and the best way to accomplish that is by having lots of, I think I mentioned it in my overview somewhere, but multi-level interaction is what I call it. So
Hmm.
not only are you playing your creatures, your opponent is wanting to interact with them, but you're also wanting to interact with their interaction, in terms of counter spells and protection spells. And I think I even have listed just like a few reanimation spells that are cheap and efficient.
It's like everybody has spells going in different directions, and so the
Exactly.
more the more those lines that cross, I think leads to some interesting counterplay.
Exactly. And it turns out there isn't too much interaction for planeswalkers because, the regular answer is just that you have to attack them. So they can die naturally.
Well, and if that's how you're winning a lot of these games, you're having to devote your resources to something that's not
Exactly.
actually winning the game.
Exactly. So no planeswalkers. And I think just on a separate level, it's nice to have a cube where you don't have to worry about the threat of a planeswalker, that you can stick to what's on board, that your interaction is going to be useful. You're not going to run into a control deck whose only win condition is Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, and you're sitting there with a bunch of fatal pushes.
Giving me flashbacks here. Don't do that.
Oh, I know. Me too. Speaking of interaction, I also excluded creatures that kind of come back easily from the graveyard or from wherever, such as Bloodsoaked Champion, Grave Crawler, those kinds of creatures that will often find themselves in like aristocrats archetypes and themes. Um, Turns out trading a Fatal Push or your other precious removal spells with a creature that just comes back the next turn doesn't feel great, and was too easy of a theme to kind of build around in this if you wanted to win.
And we could probably talk a little bit about your removal choices as it goes too, but imagine with a lot of it being one to one, as soon as you have any recursion on a creature, then you do lose some critical value by using that on like a threat that's just going to come back.
Exactly. Now your one for one removal is no longer one for one, and you feel much worse about it. Similarly, there's no creatures with hexproof or like protection from whatever. Just again, everything needs to be able to be interacted with. But one thing that they did do that's interesting is they added the ward keyword.
I was about to ask about ward.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I still haven't decided what the limit on ward that I would accept is, because it's like, what's the difference between hexproof and ward 8? You
Yeah,
know,
right. Shout out to Octavia here.
yeah, exactly. I think I put that card in the cube for one iteration just because it's technically castable for for 3 or less, and that came out immediately. Not the kind of card I'm looking for. But I think creatures with Ward 1 or Ward 2 are pretty perfect in this cube. Just you feel a little better about equipping them or putting counters on them, enchanting them, and it's not to the level that it can't be interacted with like a Slippery Bogle. It's just that you feel a little more comfortable. I guess modifying them is the word they use now, and I wanted those archetypes to still feel supported. I wanted there to be heroic and Boggles archetypes without
Without actual slippery bogle.
the yeah, without the quintessential cards, and that's kind of tough to do, but I think I've gotten part of the way there.
You noted heroic as one of the things you're pushing toward. Have you found heroic to be a challenging mechanic to balance? Does it feel like kind of an A plus B sort of thing?
So yes and no. So yes, it is challenging to balance. No, I haven't found it to feel super A plus B. I think some of the creatures tend to feel more narrow, so I try to only include the ones that feel powerful enough that you want to build around them. Examples being Feather and I guess like Illuminator Virtuoso, where it's like these are cards that if you can do the thing, it's probably going to be good. But if you consider that the A side of the A plus B, and the B is any cards that target creatures that you control, I've tried to add as many of those as I've found to be reasonable, and I think there's a pretty good level of a pretty good amount of those. And oftentimes I'll find that in most decks I play, even non-heroic decks, I want like one or two protection spells. Maybe I want a pump spell to push through damage, especially in those decks that kind of like ninjas decks where you want to be dealing combat damage to your opponent. Just there's some there's some really useful spells that don't see a lot of play in other cubes, but I think have a pretty decent shot in this cube specifically.
That's encouraging to hear.
So next one, which is the one that I find is hardest to explain to people my reasoning for is that there's no quote unquote mole drifters. So the difference between mole drifters and bane slayers is talked about quite a bit, where mole drifters are a creature or a card that you play and gain immediate value, and then typically you don't care about the creature after that. So like a mole drifter, if you think about it as you're paying 5 mana for a 2/2 flyer, you're not very happy about it. Like all that you really care about is the draw two cards there, as opposed to a Baneslayer Angel where you're investing the same amount of mana and getting nothing immediately. So you're really hoping that your Baneslayer Angel sticks around so that you can attack and hopefully win that game through your with your 5/5 evasive threat there. And so I've found, and I think you can probably agree, that Magic has kind of trended towards mole drifters being more the norm.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Right, because when you play a creature, when you play your favorite creature that you built your deck around, you want to get something out of it, and you don't want it to just die and do nothing. So Magic has kind of trended towards that being more the norm, and funny enough, I've been wanting to avoid that because I want people to care about their creatures more. I want a cube where you're when you're drafting, you're seeing all these creatures that you can build around and have different triggers that you can try to activate or just benefit you the longer they stick around. I don't want creatures that are like, oh, this is just a good creature that I'm going to put in my deck and it's always going to be good. I want creatures that you're like, huh, how am I best going to use this creature's ability? Um, and so I've not included any just straight up mole drifters. I want protection spells to be useful. I want pump spells to let your creatures dodge removal. I want you to just kind of focus on the right time to play your creatures and um, help them stick around as much as possible. And now, one note about that is there's kind of been a surge of hybrids between mole drifters and baneslayers that some people call titans, where they have an
Sure.
right, they have an ETB or attack trigger, and I have found those to be pretty okay. Usually at 3 or less mana, their triggers are not as powerful as like an Inferno Titan or a Grave Titan, and it's pretty cool to be able to have a creature that sticks around, gains you more value, but also doesn't feel super embarrassing if it just dies immediately.
Yeah, as Magic has trended toward more things that generate that immediate value, has that made it easier or harder to make changes as new sets come out?
That is a great question. Um, maybe you can agree with this, but Magic has also trended towards designing for Commander, uh, designing with the Commander format in mind.
You
And
can't
so,
see me nodding, but yeah.
okay.
Yeah, I feel that way.
And so I found that a lot of the mole drifters will end up costing 4 or more mana, and so a lot of the time I can just kind of ignore them. Um, but sometimes there are ones that are like, wow, that's a really good card, or wow, people will look at that card and think, oh, that is a tempo card. Like, oh, like a Thraben Inspector is just the or quintessential card that you play it and you gain mana, you gain value from it, and that value takes a turn or two to accrue, but it's still like a cheap creature that you're happy to put in your deck at all times. Those make it kind of hard to ignore, when there's these creatures that are just kind of ubiquitous in formats, and I'm still trying to exclude them from the cube when a lot of my cube is focused around these iconic creatures that you would expect. And when you see a tempo deck that's playing like Spyglass Siren is a cool one, it's like, maybe I should relax the restriction a little bit and allow some of these cheap 1 mana creatures, because when it comes down to it, Wizards of the Coast does, kind of know what they're doing. They're printing creatures that, if it dies, you don't feel too bad, and I don't want my players to feel too bad either. So
I think it's a reasonable goal.
It's a reasonable goal, and I did actually relax that restriction. I think I added Spyglass Siren, and then um, still the book's out. I might add a few more, but I think having the ability to relax your restrictions and not have it look like a different cube and have it still feel on theme, I think is pretty important.
Yeah, I think that leads in nicely to one of the things that I really appreciated in your overview, where you said your goal for the cube was a quote very clear but general image in my head of how I want the drafts and games to go, end quote. And I love that description. How would you begin to describe that image if you have a sense of what you're wanting?
Very generally. I should say a huge thank you to everyone who has helped me iterate on this cube, because it has definitely been just so many people have given me advice or suggestions, and I feel bad every time I have to turn one down or try to explain why, like, no, that doesn't quite fit. But I have had this kind of like I said, a specific but general image of what I want the cube to look like. And I can point to any card, any new card that gets printed, and be like, wow, that is a perfect tempo cube card. um, I guess one example from the most recent set was Overprotect. Overprotect is one and a green for an instant. Its target creature gets +3/+3, and then what is it, like trample, hexproof, and
Trample, hexproof, and indestructible.
oh, is it indestructible?
Yeah.
Okay, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
This is right. So this is a great protection spell that can also be used aggressively. So it has a lot of different modes that you can play it with. Whether you're protecting your creature from a removal spell, whether you're blocking and looking to trade up, or whether you're just trying to push through damage. And those kinds of cards that provide like multi-level interaction, like I mentioned earlier, and then just provide lots of different options for how you play them, and in what decks you play them, and in what with what creatures you play them. I'm looking for cards that fit a lot of roles very efficiently.
So let's talk a little bit about multi-level interaction. So this is something that has come up in other conversations I've had along the way, but finding cards that fit multiple roles can be tricky. Do you have a heuristic for approaching that, or do you have a trick to trying to find good things that are going to interact on multiple axes?
Hmm. It's tough to think about because I feel like cubes in general are pretty darn good at the first level of interaction. Most cubes will have a bunch of counter spells in blue, a bunch of burn in red, and then various forms of removal in specifically black, white, and red with the burn. But not a lot of cubes run protection spells or combat tricks or um, another one that I just have on my overview is Unearth, which is just, you don't think of it as interaction, but it is kind of a way to bring back a creature that has been interacted with previously. In this cube anyway. In other cubes, you might have combos you can do with it, or you're sacrificing things multiple times. But it's hard when not a lot of other cubes are playing cards, and you're looking for that specific kind of effect. I think Wizard of the Coast has actually done a much better job at printing these effects recently. And one thing that I specifically try to look for is um, cards that do one thing that most decks would want, such as removal, but also have an alternate mode that it may come up less often or is a little bit more narrow in other environments, but in this cube might come up much more frequently. One that I have that I added semi recently is Valorous Stance, which was pretty popular in its standard format.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, from what I can remember.
good at killing dragons.
That's right. So 2 mana, target creature gains indestructible or destroy target creature with toughness 4 or greater. So both of those modes aren't, super powerful. Like, it's not always going to have a target to kill, and you may sit with it in hand for a while without having something to protect. But both of the effects, when they're good, they're great. Removing something for 2 mana is about the efficiency that you want, and being able to protect your important creature when you need it is equally as important. So um, cards that aren't as powerful as other options, like it's no Path to Exile or Swords to Plowshares, but it can serve a similar purpose, just slightly less of the time, but it has more purposes, which is the kind of thing that I'm looking for here. I'll shout out one of my favorite recent cards, which is Getaway Glamour
Yeah.
from Thunder Junction, which basically does exactly what I was talking about with Valorous Stance. It protects something or it kills something, but it can also do a lot more than just that. So, perfect card.
As you're working to balance removal and protection, how do you avoid having a deck that's all removal be the ideal route in a creature centric environment?
Well, for a long time in this cube's history, it was, and some would say it still is. I used to have Swords to Plowshares in this cube. I used to have several other just hard removal spells. I had Eliminate. I had all of the Bolt variants like Chain Lightning. So I used to have all of the most efficient removal spells because my thought process was people are going to want these and they're iconic cards and this is the home for them.
And their maximal tempo too.
Right, they're maximal, exactly 1 mana answer to anything. That's perfect tempo.
It's worked since alpha. Why change?
Exactly, I know, right? um, but just as you described, when you have all of those efficient removal spells, then the decks that are going to perform best in this cube are the ones that play all of those efficient removal spells and then a few creatures to carry themselves across the line. But as long as they can deal with all of your opponent's threats, then they don't have to worry about dying or losing. You just kind of remove everything. There's no planeswalker that's going to grind you out of advantage or whatever enchantment there might be that you can't interact with. Yeah, just being able to trade 1 mana for any threat is pretty powerful.
So then it sounds like you made some changes to counteract that a little bit.
That's right. To some of my frequent players' dismay, I ended up cutting quite a few of them, and I'm still kind of in the process of cutting down removal spells. But it's definitely gotten a lot closer to what I'm imagining. And not only am I removing the most efficient ones, I'm also removing some of the maybe less efficient ones that just ended up with I ended up with a bulk of too many removal spells. So it's like, choosing which ones do I cut, which ones do I leave in. Obviously, cutting the most powerful of them and then leaving in some of the iconic ones. Like, I still want Fatal Push in the cube just because it's pretty quintessential, and it does take some work to be able to destroy the 3 mana creatures that tend to be a bit bigger. Same with Lightning Bolt, just a classic card. But since I've been working on balancing the removal spells, I've been looking at new cards with a bit of a different lens, and I'm instead of just looking for the default what do they call it, like the F&M promo removal spells, like
Yeah.
your Eliminate, like every set has one, right? It's like Eliminate,
Fell
Long
most recently.
Goodbye,
Yeah.
yeah, Fell, like just they love printing these 2 mana just almost hard removal spells, and they're great in their formats. They're probably great in most cubes just because cubes need ways to answer threats. And since a lot of cubes have much larger threats where they have planeswalkers, then, these more efficient removal spells are much more fitting there. But I tend to ignore those now completely and instead look for removal spells that are less powerful, or they're soft removal spells where they don't always kill a thing but they might get you close, or they might work some of the time but not others, but then they have some other thing that makes them interesting. One of my favorites, and I always rank every card in the new set whenever a new set drops in terms of how good of a tempo cube card it is. And I think the only S tier one that I had for Modern Horizons 3, um, probably never guess it, but was Wither and Bloom.
Oh, hey, I love that card.
I love it, right? It's 2 mana, give a creature -3/-3, which will usually kill something, but can be countered with pump spells or protection spells. And it has the uh, kind of a flashback mode of you can pay 2 mana and exile it from your graveyard to put a +1/+1 counter on a creature. So this is a removal spell that's less efficient, less powerful than something like Eliminate, but it does something else that's interesting that may get like when you're drafting a deck around +1/+1 counters, you might rate it a little higher than you would something like Eliminate. If you're given the choice between that and another card that would work in your deck, you might prefer the one that synergizes with the other cards that you've picked so far.
And you get another access to play in case it gets milled or discarded or something like that. That it has just some other way to engage other than just being a removal spell.
Exactly. Having more modes to play makes removal spells just a little more interesting than just, hey, I'm just going to kill your threat, and I'm going to keep doing that until I win.
Multi-level interaction. There we are.
Yep, that's right.
So, what have you found most surprising about working on the Tempo Cube over these years?
Hmm. One thing that may be kind of funny is I've found that some people really love this cube and it really speaks to them, and they tell me all about it, and like they want to tell me about what they drafted and what changes they want to make and what cards they really liked. And then other people just really don't like it. Like they'll draft it once and be like, "Huh, that's not for me. I'm probably not going to draft this again." I'm like, "All right then."
That's
And
valid feedback.
right. And I guess I hadn't really considered that when I was first stepping into the cube scene, because I show up and whatever cube people are wanting to draft, I'm like, cool, let's do it. Like I love drafting cube. But it's made me realize that maybe my vision and my image of what I want this cube to be is perhaps a little too specific for what other people are looking for. Other people may really like battle cruiser style Magic, where you're slamming haymakers or large creatures or planeswalkers, and my cube really does not does not allow any of that. So I get it. People have different ways they want to enjoy the game.
Well, and that different experience can be valuable for different folks too. Like you said, that polarization is certainly a double-edged sword where folks will you really enjoy or really not enjoy.
Exactly. It does provide good feedback, I will say. Like that's how most of the cards that have entered the Hall of Fame in the Tempo Cube have been cut, because they just lead to very miserable gameplay that people come away from the experience just not not enjoying the games played. So that's how Luris came out. That's
Mm.
how Walking Ballista came out. Just cards that were absolutely oppressive and should not be in the cube.
Lurrus seems brave in a cube with a restriction to have 3 or less mana.
I know. I think we even tried like not letting you companion it, and it was still too strong, just because the immediate value of being able to get something back right when you play it and just being able to keep doing that over and over was a little ridiculous.
What design principles do you take from the Tempo Cube to apply to your other projects?
Design principles, as well as I guess design practices, which is um, not I know I recognize not everyone has this, but I had the privilege of being able to play test the cube, especially in its infancy, quite a bit. Just online drafting in actually Caleb Gannon's Discord server. We drafted this cube a lot, almost weekly at times, and getting that constant feedback and being able to iterate very quickly on it was really important to capture that initial groundwork of how I wanted to balance the cube and what I wanted, archetypes to look like, and what I wanted the kind of average power level to be. Um, so play testing and being able to practice is something that I would strive for in any new project that I work on. Um, as far as design principles, I think uh, one thing that I would tell other designers is that if you have an idea of the kind of gameplay you want to curate, or what what kind of game you want to see, it can be it can be anything. You can think of any way that you want to play a game of Magic, and balance a cube to support that goal. I know a lot of cubes tend to focus on, what card can I add to this cube that would really like fit this one niche, and I add a bunch of cards that I really like and that play well together, and you end up with what a lot of cubes look like, which is you know, you're drafting a good deck and you're playing, a game of cube. And I think a lot of people could look at a game of vintage cube or modern cube and be able to recognize, oh, that's a modern cube, or that's a vintage cube. This is what I expect a normal game of cube or limited to look like. But if you really want to do something wacky, you can. You can go for it. And it takes a lot of balancing to do. And the first few drafts you do, the power level may be way off, or like one deck is ridiculously oppressive. And that's that's something I'm still working on with the Tempo Cube. I think every trophy draft at CubeCon included black as one of the colors.
Hmm.
And it's interesting, and it may not necessarily be a bad thing, but it's something to consider, and it's something that I could probably design away if I viewed that as a problem to solve. Um, but yeah, any kind of gameplay that you're into, you can design a cube around it, and you can make it work.
This is like the Reading Rainbow song, right? You can do anything.
Exactly. I guess one other takeaway is that in the same vein as when you're balancing a cube, don't always use the best version of whatever effect you're looking for. You don't like A cube isn't going to be lacking or hurting because you didn't play Swords to Plowshares. Like if you play, I don't know, like a Journey to Nowhere, for it's a 2 mana sorcery speed removal spell. It's still a removal spell. It's slower and it's less efficient, but hey, maybe your cube has an enchantment theme, and this Journey to Nowhere suddenly becomes a lot more interesting than a Swords to Plowshares, simply because it interacts, like it works better in your deck, even though it's not the most efficient. And if you do that, across the board, you can really kind of curate the the cube gameplay experience in a way that is much harder to do if you're trying to look for the highest power level of whatever cards you're looking for.
I think you've really nailed it in what you just said. But in summary, what advice would you give to other designers as they're looking at their own cubes and thinking about some of what you've said here?
If you find kind of the niche that you're trying to fill with your cube, do your digging and look on Scryfall or whatever card search engine you use, and you'll find a lot of cards that you probably didn't know existed just because they haven't been used elsewhere, and that can really make for unique experiences for your drafters. Just doing the diligence and not always going for the same cards that you see in other cubes, or sometimes even when there's a new set comes out and everyone's excited about, oh, this one card, but maybe this other card is just the right kind of thing that you're looking for in your cube. I think that can add a lot to the experience of drafters. Even though some will say that when there's a bunch of cards that they haven't seen before, they're like, oh, this is kind of a lot of overhead, but and you have to do a lot of reading of the new cards, but it's still like they're unique cards, and they end up being fun to play with if they're purposefully included in the cube. I think every card that you put in the cube doesn't have to serve like a specific purpose. Like, oh, I see this card is what I want black decks to be doing. It doesn't have to be that. It just have a card that's like, oh, I want this card to be I want it to be kind of the baseline of a power level for this effect I'm looking for. Like Wither and Bloom, I want that to be like the quintessential removal spell in the Tempo Cube, where it's like, this is a card that is great at what it does. It's a removal spell, which is what a lot of decks are looking for, but it also has other reasons to put it in your deck that aren't just like, I'm putting this card in my deck because it's a removal spell and I need removal spells. It's also putting a counter on my Barkhide Trolls so that I can right, so that I can protect my creature for another turn. It's look for interesting effects, and I think you'll be pleasantly surprised at what you find.
As we lean toward wrapping up, one of my favorite questions to ask is, if you could have any card printed as a promo, which card would you have done and who would you have do the illustration?
I think one that speaks to me specifically, which is obviously is going to be a card in my cube, and it's Jolrael Monvoli Recluse, which is a green 2 mana creature that whenever you draw your second card each turn, you make a 2/2 cat. And then it has another ability that I've never seen come up, but the important part is that first ability, which is just such an interesting card to me, because whenever I see it in someone's cube, I'm like, wow, that cube is doing something interesting, because that's an effect that you wouldn't expect to see on a green card, which is caring about drawing your second card in a turn. So I think I really love that card's role in my cube, and it's really cool when I see people use it to its fullest effect. And the artist I would want to illustrate this promo would be Julie Dillon, who's
Yeah,
yeah, she's a more recent Magic artist. Uh, she's had a lot more cards illustrations done in recent sets, but I really like her kind of storybook illustration look, and I think she could do something pretty cool with a queen and her cats.
absolutely. Oh, she's done a lot of really neat sci-fi illustrations along the way too. But yeah,
Yes, that too,
storybook is
definitely.
the perfect descriptor. I will note that I have been on the receiving end of Joel Riel's second ability, and it's rough.
It can be for sure.
It feels like, Turner, that we have barely scratched the surface on the Tempo Cube. There's so much that we could continue to explore, and on several of your other projects as well. If folks want to learn more about the Tempo Cube or take a look at some of the other things you're working on, where would be the best place to point them?
Yeah, good question. I'm active on Discord. I'm in the Cube Talk server, and if you ever wanna ping me or ask me any questions, my DMs are always open. Um, my profile name there is Grenrut, which is just Turner backwards with a G in the front, so it should be pretty easy to remember. But I'm also active on Cube Cobra, and if you respond to any of my blog posts for each set, or if you have a question about any of my cubes, I'm happy to answer there as well.
Well, this has been a blast for me. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk through the Tempo Cube. I'm looking forward to an opportunity, hopefully, to connect in the fall, maybe play a little bit of it. But thank you so much for taking the time to do it.
Of course, yeah. Thanks for having me on. I don't think I've talked at length this much about the Tempo Cube, maybe ever. So it was fun to kind of organize all my thoughts and be able to put them down on a recording.
Well, it's a joy to unpack together.
Yeah,
Thanks for being part of this.
of course. Thank you very much.